David London. I'm a principal of the cybersecurity practice at the Chertoff Group, and I'll be hosting the podcast today, Building a Defensible Security Program in the Age of Mythos. Our conversation today is going to be focused on two converging issues. One is the emergence of Anthropic's Mythos model, and the second is on the acceleration of AI-assisted coding. And together, those two issues are rebalancing and recalibrating the security equation for our audience today, which are everything from C-suite to security leadership, governance, risk, and compliance professionals, and cybersecurity practitioners. I'm very pleased today to be joined by three panelists, all of whom are Chertoff Group senior advisors. The first is Michael Johnson, who's held CIO and CISO positions both in the government and in the commercial sector, most recently as the CISO of Meta Financial Technologies. Semi Miguez, who's been a cybersecurity innovator all of his life. He was the creator of the Building Security and Maturity Model, or BSIM, which is a leading framework for building and measuring application security programs. And Dan Sutherland. Dan was the first chief counsel for the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency within DHS, and most recently served as the lead for the legal team supporting Meta's Chief Information Security Officer. Welcome, gentlemen, and thanks for joining today. I'd like to kick off the conversation with a discussion around Mythos. A lot has been said, a lot has been written, a lot has been published around the emergence of Mythos, which is Anthropic's model, which can string together and chain a series of vulnerabilities and generate exploits at what has been reported to be unprecedented speed. So I'd probably like to start with Michael. There have been varying levels of urgency around Mythos. So can you provide a little perspective, Michael, on Mythos in general and how this is a departure from what we've seen in the past with regards to AI modeling and cybersecurity capability?
Yeah, I'd be happy to, David. Thank you. Yeah, so as most people are well aware, right, in early testing, Mythos successfully identified thousands of zero-day vulnerabilities across basically every major operating system and web browser that exist. And what's most telling about this, right, is it identified flaws that evaded even human review for decades, right? So this is essentially on steroids, taking the best red teamers you've ever seen and putting 1,000 of their brains together to have their collective wisdom and find problems. What really makes Mythos different, right, is that it's a combination of vast source code ingestion. Some estimates are that it has ingested 98% of all publicly available source code, an autonomous real-time capability to ingest proprietary libraries, meaning specific to products and services that your company may care about, and then the ability to simulate, understand, and rewrite complex software. So like other large language models, Mythos' training data spans practically all publicly available information, open documentation, software libraries, processes, policy, etc. Through the agentic systems like Claude Code, right, the AI can dynamically read and ingest proprietary data sets on the fly, meaning it can very quickly learn specifics of your business and what you care about. And then rather than just storing code, it allows it to simulate, understand, and rewrite complex software. And that's the real key, right? So it can understand, develop exploits, test them, et cetera, all in real time, which means it not only finds things, but it's able to exploit them and validate them in real time. So quite a departure from sort of the manual test cycle that we were used to not long ago.
Thanks, Michael. And, you do hear in certain corners of cynics that this is a savvy marketing, ploy by Anthropic to kind of elevate their brand and pierce through the noise and the kind of competitive nature of the frontier models. Sammy, what do you make of that? Big deal, little deal, no deal? understand you may not will put in one of those. It may apply to all of those categories at different times, but what's your perspective as a software security expert and practitioner?
So it's a big deal. It's a big deal today, and it's going to be a big deal for a little while. You know, PCI was a big deal for a while. GDPR was a big deal for a while, and then cyber insurance and the exclusions were a big deal for a while, and then we all learned how to live with it. All the sort of Jenga pieces kind of mashed together. The lawyers agreed with the engineers agreed with the executive management, and we all sort of achieved a kind of status quo on good enough. And I think that's gonna take a little while here, to amplify, what Michael said, it really, for me, from my perspective, what's changed is that, you know, it's always been the case that each of us knows what each of us knows. And so you had to sort of get a team together to do some really complex things. And getting a team together wasn't always easy. And even when you got the right team together, they couldn't necessarily work together. And that part has sort of gone out of the window now. So you could get a team of the most successful hackers from an LLM perspective, all working on the same thing. Now they don't have the same these LLMs don't have the same imagination that a team of hackers have. But when you've seen every line of code ever written, you've seen every exploit ever created, you've started to become goal oriented in a way that you need to get from here to there, then you see this is what we're seeing. We're seeing that this is possible. If a human knew everything about everything and could remember everything, your proverbial full stack developer from 1999, the one guy with the big beard and a cigar he smoked at his desk in the office and nobody said anything. Then you can do this and it works. And that's what we're seeing now. And again, what's interesting, big problem going to little problem, going to bigger problem. What's interesting is that these hacking abilities, this is sort of an emergent behavior. This isn't what they built. This is what it does. So we're going to go from big problem to small problem. When someone builds something that does this on purpose, that's going to be a big problem. That's going to be a really big problem.
Thanks, Debbie. So the community obviously is trying to respond and adapt to this. One of the controversial sort of developments as a complement to Mythos is the Project Glasswing, which was originally a closed community of about 50 major technology companies and banks who got an advanced look at Mythos and could point it internally. And I think collectively we've spoken to a lot of practitioners within that tent. But Michael, what do you think about the sort of Glasswing model? And is it a good countermeasure to the potential malicious use of Mythos, at least in the near term?
Yeah, well, look, interestingly, just yesterday, depending on when you're watching this, June 2nd, Anthropic announced expanding the number of organizations that have access to Cloud Mythos under the Project Glasswing to another 150 companies. They did emphasize in their press release that they will continue to focus that on essential infrastructure providers, maintainers of critical open source, and safety testers. But they were very clear to say that the group would be expanded to include international representation and extend sort of the geographic reach of where they are. Look, it's extremely capable system. I'm talking with CISOs that are in the original group all the time, and 2 or 3 of them have said it's been a game changer for their products and services as far as the volume and the number of critical sort of both flaws and capabilities and issues they've been able to resolve in a very short period of time. So expanding this more broadly in a controlled way seems like the right approach given the capability. But as everyone knows, right, Anthropic's not the only one that has this level of capability, and there are other similar, maybe even better capabilities that are now more broadly in the hands of both, good guys and bad guys. So it's something we have to be mindful of.
Well, let's talk a little bit about that. We have a separate question on some of those comparable models, but might as well cover it now. The UK AI Security Committee reported that ChatGPT 5.5, for example, has commensurate capabilities with Mythos, and ChatGPT has announced that they're planning to distribute that model more broadly using some sort of, kind of KYC or know your customer gating process. Do we think that's the appropriate answer? I mean, the challenge here among a lot of practitioners is the haves versus the have-nots. And so you're going to get a pretty significant level of risk reduction because those 50 or 200 kind of Glasswing members represent a very large portion of the risk surface. But what about the organizations that have not been kind of invited into that community? And is the answer to plan for Mythos or to plan for all of the subsequent models and their capability, like ChatGPT 5.5?
Yeah, look, I'll start. I know Sammy and Dan will probably have things to add. You stated it just right? It's the have and have not companies. Not only do they need access to these tools and capabilities, and as you point out, there's going to be broader access to equivalent capabilities very soon, if not already. But you have to have the talent, right? Like you have to have the talent and the capabilities to harness these capabilities at pace and scale, right? It's not a simple thing just to say, oh, great, let's have our security team, our engineering team now have access to this and use it in an appropriate, in a positive way. You got to have the talent and the infrastructure, the harness, all the other things you need in place to be able to use this in a productive way. And some large companies that already have very advanced engineering, technical cultures, and capable security teams, great. They're going to do really well with this. A lot of other companies aren't, right? They're just not going to be able to stand up to what's necessary in this sort of arms race of offense and defense and capabilities.
Thanks, Michael. Sammy, from your side, broadening the access to these types of models, does that accelerate the the possibility of the very bad day that we've talked about as we've started forming our thoughts around this panel? Or does it try to manage the kind of persistent asymmetry between threat actor and security professional?
Again, if I were a betting man and I had the money to do it, I still wouldn't know which side of this to bet on, because while I'll have to use these kinds of tools, whether it's Mythos or something else, to make my software better, a lot of the bad stuff that exploits my software doesn't necessarily get into my software through my software. It comes in through software supply chain insecurities. It comes in through phishing emails. It comes in through my browser. It comes in through those 150 companies that this is being expanded to. So while my infrastructure, and I don't mean literally networks, I mean my infrastructure, my laptops, my web browsers, my cloud providers, all of that is getting stronger. I have to spend all my time keeping up with my software and using this on my software. If I have exactly what Michael said, if I have the skill, the time, and the money for tokens to do it, then I can at least find the problems. But as everybody who's ever worked in risk management in GRC knows, finding the problems and making a list of them to your regulators actually makes you more risky than not knowing the problems existed, because now you know about them and now everybody wants to know what you're doing about them. So again, if you don't have the remediation expertise to go along with this free discovery expertise, you're not going to get anywhere. And really your saving grace is that everybody around you is getting better and protecting you, shielding you, while you're running around with your little toothpick trying to kill goblins in your software.
Thanks for painting us a picture, Sam. I agree with that. And also, when we talk to some practitioners on the front lines and we try to understand sort of the gravity of Mythos, some of the most prevalent initial access, vectors have nothing to do with exploitation of a vulnerability. It's a misconfiguration in a gateway. It's a identity subversion and the theft of credentials standing in the shoes of a legitimate user. So all of these things are persistent problems that really are not necessarily within the Mythos or advanced AI cybersecurity model kind of scanning and exploitation capability. Dan, I want to get you involved in the conversation. This is obviously all greenfield, uncharted legal and regulatory landscape here. I mean, this was evidenced even a week and a half, 2 weeks ago when we all anticipated President Trump's executive order to be released, and it was delayed because of some internal misalignment around the level of sort of regulatory heavy-handedness that's embedded in the executive order. And so we can talk a little bit more about the executive order, which was just released yesterday. But taking a step back, what do you think the overall kind of regulatory compliance implications are for the emergence of Mythos and Mythos class models?
Yeah, I think we've been in a very quiet period in terms of regulatory activity for the past, let's say, 18 months. There just hasn't been a lot of activity, a lot of enforcement activity, new laws passed, new regulations being issued. I think we now can see the ship of state turning, and we're moving into a new environment now. And I think it's related to Mythos, but the other models that have come out now that can do the type of work that Michael and Sammy have just been talking about. This has grabbed the attention of policymakers in Washington. You can see it in a number of ways. One is the executive order that you just mentioned. I don't think it would have been ever in play had it not been for Mythos. We can talk about more the depths of the executive order if you'd like to, but just the issuance of it. I think you can also see it in Treasury Secretary Bessent called in all the heads of the banks and briefed them, or was briefed by them. They all discussed the implications of Mythos. You can see it in the context of the Commerce Department that put out a statement that it had reached an agreement with, I think it was 3 of the model developers, that they were going to allow the Commerce Department to begin doing pre-release vetting. That was taken down when there was all this discussion inside the White House about what the executive order should look like. I think you can see it in the UK, as you mentioned, David. They're also have started doing pre-release vetting. So I think there's just a lot of activity, and I think this executive order, while it emphasizes voluntary activity, partnership activity, for example, it creates a AI cybersecurity clearinghouse, which is basically, I think, intended to be like a public-private information sharing portal where people can discuss the issues. That's voluntary. And it creates other infrastructure that is voluntary. It sets up the option for using that infrastructure later in a more mandatory way. So again, I think this a big deal? Technically, I think we've laid out an analysis, big, medium, no deal. In terms of regulatory or legal, I think it turns towards the big deal. It's caught people's attention. I think things are different now.
That's helpful, Dan. And it's clearly the EO establishes an expectation that is highly reliant on voluntary actions and cooperation from industry. And there's been discussion on whether that's its final intent, or that it paves the way towards a kind of more mandatory pre-release submission to the government. And how important that is to address potential cybersecurity implications, particularly, if in the hands of malicious actors, versus, continuing to promote the growth and innovation of these frontier models. Michael, what do you think about the executive order and the kind of future of regulation for AI as it relates to the Mythos, but more broadly for kind of harnessing the power and innovation of the frontier model developers.
Yeah, look, like every CIO and CISO knows, everybody knows, right? Public policy always trails technology advancements. I think what's most worrying here, right, if you're a CIO or a CISO, right, is the existential implications to your business of the capabilities like Mythos, and the fact that the legal, regulatory, financial, even insurance frameworks that businesses rely on right now, and that are, I'd say, pretty brittle still from a security from a security focus point of view. They're like ill-equipped to deal with the consequence of this technology, right? So, and and where that's best seen, I can tell you, having been in the seat CIO and CISO many times, is, on a good day, usually those frameworks, including the EO, but also other regulatory frameworks that we see, as Stan mentioned, emerging in the EU, et cetera, they're kind of dealing with good day kind of stuff, in my opinion, right? But when you're a CIO and CISO, like, your homework is graded on the bad day, right? And none of this stuff is anticipating any of the bad day kind of important elements of these frameworks that need to be addressed, including indemnification and all of the other things that will become really important on a bad day. If there's, for example, someone using a tool or capability like Mythos identifies in your products and services, possibly without your permission, fatal flaws that you have not addressed in a reasonable amount of time, and those lead to material harm to a customer, that's going to be a really bad day.
I think that also brings us to the point around the kind of inherent asymmetry of these frontier models, the cyber capabilities inherent within Mythos. Putting aside Sammy's point that isn't even purpose built for doing cyber harm, where the kind of real impacts can occur. But can we talk a little bit about that sort of asymmetry? The bad actors obviously have first mover advantage. Michael, you've always said that, you said just before that, kind of the regulatory response is always going to kind of trail technology innovation. But I want to start with Dan and thinking through, before we talk about how, AI can potentially be, what are the countermeasures, what can practitioners do? Oftentimes, the governance and risk and compliance function is lagging, just like the kind of regulatory pronouncements are. So how do organizations try to keep up with the governance compliance function, kind of run alongside them? Dan, obviously with your and Michael's background at Meta, where things obviously moved quite fast, how do you keep pace?
Yeah, I think our inclination at this time is to set aside governance, risk, and compliance. Innovation's moving, the world is changing, and to set this aside. And I would argue, I think my colleagues here would argue as well, no, this is a time to improve and make your GRC faster, but GRC is not passé. It is more critical than ever. But the problem is that governance, risk, and compliance and the attendant legal advice to it has to move as fast as innovation. So you've got to move with agility, speed, innovation, quick thinking. Michael and I confronted this when we were both at Meta, because, as you say, we were confronting very quick turnarounds as technology was developing. In some of the ways that we dealt with it, and this is something we can discuss, at length in a number of ways, but I'll just quickly touch on a few things, is we had to develop templates. We knew what our key decision makers needed to see, how they thought through problems, and what was the information that they needed. So we had templates of this information they're going to need, and it needs to be filled out. The second thing is we need to get the right people in place, already early in place. So you have the right, as we would say in Meta, XFNs. You had the right decision makers already assembled. The third thing is you need to have leadership support. Lawyers don't issue complex risk management advice on complex risk management issues in 90 minutes. This is not what we do. We write 50-page memos. This is how we're trained. we had to have buy-in from the leadership of the legal department to understand this is the way law is going to be practiced. We have your back. We understand it. And so you have leadership support, and I think Michael had to have that in the GRC space as well. So you have to have leadership support for that as well. You've got to have all of those ducks in a row, and you need to do it in up front so that it can move at the right pace.
Thanks, Dan. From Michael, from your seat as the CISO of Meta Financial Technologies, how did you operate with that faster pace? How are you able to kind of apply fast GRC in a way that, kept up, was at the kind of commensurate tempo with the business?
Yeah, it's great. And the way Dan described it is perfect. The way to think of it as a CISO, right, is that the old template, right, is you have a policy framework, you have controls, you put and paste those controls, you explain them collaboratively with the business, right? And you ask the business to operate in between those guardrails, if you will, et cetera. And of course, that whole model that's gone, right? Like that just doesn't work anymore. So the new model, right, is that if you want to call it your GRC team, but your security team needs to run alongside the business. The business needs to do whatever it needs to do at pace and scale. And then you need to be at the same time sort of codifying, if you will, what those guardrails with air quotes are, so that the next time the business tries to do the same thing or something related, it can be done in an automated way, so that the business can continue to move, et cetera. So it's a much more interactive sort of real-time negotiation, if you will, between security and the business, et cetera, where security really has to become an enabler, right? If something bad happens and the business is subject to some threat realized, that's because you as a security team didn't enable them at speed and scale to be able to do what they needed to do. But I know Sammy has a lot of experience in this as well, so I'll let Sammy jump in.
So Sammy, Michael obviously is looking for a view from your perch with regards to how GRC can keep up with the speed of business. We're going to be discussing that in more detail as we think about AI-enabled and AI-assisted coding. But any initial thoughts from you before we move on?
Sure. I'm just going to throw out a couple of buzzwords for people playing buzzword bingo at home, and then we can move on. We've talked about infrastructure as code, security as code, governance as code for a long time. We, as an industry, we've gotten pretty not bad at infrastructure as code. We've made some progress on security as code. Governance as code still eludes a lot of people and a lot of organizations. This is going to be a forcing function to get better at that. So there you have at least 6 buzzwords.
All right. Well, we'll keep the meter running, Sammy, for some of our other questions. So let's pivot a bit. We've been talking a lot about the threat environment, potential impacts. We touched on how sort of the regulatory compliance and governance needs to keep pace with both the business and the defenders on the ground. But I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about some of the core controls and safeguards that are going to have kind of outsized risk reduction as we think about Mythos class models. So asset visibility has always been a cornerstone of an effective security program. You cannot defend, you cannot detect what you do not know exists. So I guess the question is, in today's environment with machine speed, asset enumeration that could potentially be in the hands of a bad actor, Michael, I'll start with you. How can organizations kind of inoculate themselves from that? And what does asset visibility look like for a defender now?
Yeah, great. You're spot on, right? And I think what's really great about your question and pose it is that in my experience, 30 plus years in security, right, few companies understand or manage their asset inventory well, like very few. And by that, what I mean is have comprehensive visibility over their attack surface, let alone needing to have insights into third parties, that sort of thing. Threat detection capabilities, drift management, et cetera. So asset management gaps can now be exploited in real time, right? This is the world we live in. And so companies can no longer rely on, point in time updated CMDBs and that kind of stuff. If they are, they're in extreme danger. So the challenge, right, is to evolve very quickly to sort of what's been termed like a Mythos-ready security program. And so there's sort of two parts to that in a simplified view, right? One is the operational or incident response focused short term, right, where you have real-time asset insights, et cetera. You're watching for drift management, you know what's going on, so that the minute something's identified, you can say that does or does not apply to us. Here's the parts of the business that need to be aware, et cetera. And then there's the second part, which is the strategic, or sort of what I like to call the resilience focus side of it, right? Which is more longer term, which is where you're looking at like, where are we consistently investing to do things like burn down tech debt and things like end of life, end of service, et cetera, which just only expands our attack surface, those kind of things. And having that sort of focus on those things in addition to significantly upping your game in application security and vulnerability management are all going to be key focus areas for successful programs going forward.
Well, a related topic is that, again, in order to understand your environment, you need a kind of real-time and runtime asset inventory, in part because you need to understand what may be vulnerable, what weaknesses may exist across your technology estate. So obviously, given the potential, flood of vulnerabilities and weaknesses that are going to be identified by these types of models, it's going to have the effect of aggravating what is oftentimes an extended mean time to patch, mean time to remediate chasm that a lot of organizations are already suffering from. And so maybe, Sammy, you can start. How does an organization respond to that? How do they implement and manage a machine speed response that, can practically keep pace with the vulnerabilities that are going to be uncovered by some of these models?
It's interesting because governance-driven organizations are going to start from the top, and engineering-driven organizations are going to start from the bottom, and neither of them are going to be right until they meet in the middle. It's going to be weird for a while. So, when we start from the top, we're talking about our tone at the top. We're talking about our risk appetite. We're talking about translating that into policy, taking into account compliance, governance, regulatory, legal, statutory, contractual, and turning that into what agentic AI, for example, can and can't do. Remember, it's a toddler, and it's an angry toddler because it's goal-oriented. And so it's going to do what it needs to do to get to its goal. You have to tell it everything. You can't tell it, look at my sock data and see if you see anything weird. You have to tell it everything, every step, every day. And so as we drive from the top, we're going to have to do something that most executives in GRC organizations have never done. And that is codify how they govern the organization. Why don't they do it? It's not because they don't know what they're doing. It's because the more you codify it, the more brittle it becomes and the longer it takes to execute. You literally get the yips trying to execute your GRC because you're trying to think about the next step instead of just doing it. And so that's going to take a while. As you come from the bottom up, this SAST tool says it's a critical. Okay, well, that's not good enough. I have 1,000 criticals. So how do I graduate that into the really critical criticals? How do I marry CVSS and EPSS and the KEV and marrying that to my crown jewels on this network that protects this data in this organization, in this geography? So from the bottom up, it's not just, well, tell me which critical is most important, AppSec team. We're going to have to work together to really layer in all that stuff so that the criticals, kind of like the known knowns, are really going to float to the top, and they're going to do so on a consistent, defensible basis. Well, I have to codify all that. Nobody's going to sit down and codify all that. So what are they going to do? They're going to ask ChatGPT to do it for them. It doesn't know anything about the local environment, just like it doesn't know anything about the tone at the top and the risk appetite in this organization. And so the two ends are going to collide in the middle, and it's just going to squish out like the balloon where the eyes pop out until they really get to some kind of stasis. And it's going to be the lawyers and the cyber insurance companies who are going to help define, well, that's unacceptable, that's acceptable, that'll be a lawsuit, etc. So that's my view.
Well, that's helpful. I mean, I think most in the security practitioner community recognize that agentic AI and orchestration is not a panacea, certainly not immediately. And there's a significant amount of teaching that needs to occur, and ingestion and enrichment and automation in order to, and executives need to get more comfortable with agents making initial decisions and having a level of confidence with a human backstop, but not necessarily a human in every single loop, because a human in every single loop will be a drag on the process as it has been historically. In the remaining segment, I'd like to pivot once more. We've been talking a lot about AI sort of as the threat vector and kind of defensive mechanisms, but I'd also like to talk about what the implications are for the rise of AI-assisted coding. I think we've all heard a number of statistics on just the kind of exponential volume of code generation, and that is not linear over the past year. GitHub has reported they expect a 16-fold increase in the number of commits within GitHub between 2025 and 2026. And so software security programs are already struggling to keep pace with the tempo of code commits, code generation. So, and organizations, have historically had challenges trying to manage that pace in order to provide a level of product assurance to their customers. And so, how do organizations begin thinking about addressing this pace and this tempo of code generation? Maybe I can start with you, Sam, and you've touched on some of this, but rather than admire, some of the challenge that we've all been kind of enumerating around this as we get more comfortable with agentic AI, how do organizations begin to adapt to that new reality?
The short answer is that the human aspects still only know how to deal with what the human aspects know how to deal with. And so we're going to have to carefully and artfully distinguish between what we're all going to allow an AI to decide or respond on, so an agent, and what we're going to allow AI to do with its decisions, so agentic, and what risk ownership from a racy perspective that we're going to require a human to maintain. Okay, we can't transfer risk to our PCI assessor just because they assessed our PCI. We still own the risk. Okay, so I have 8,000 agents and I have 800 agentic things as a CISO. I have 4 humans and I have 8,804 people working for me. Who owns the risk? Well, I do. That's my job. So as we separate out what humans must own and what AI can own, then we'll start to delineate some of the things that you just talked about. The other part of it is, and then I'll stop. The other part of it is, in the short term, a human can only review, let's just say, 200 lines of code in a merge request, a pull request, an MRPR. Maybe 250. If somebody sends me an MR with 500 lines of code changed, I reject. I'm not even going to reject. You need to tighten this down. Well, a coding agent, Claude can probably write 1,000 lines of code at a time, 5,000. It can take 500,000 lines of COBOL and turn it into, 250,000 lines of Java. And that's one MR. What am I going to do with that? And so I need to define these guardrails, regardless of how fast AI can go, that fits into the processes I have today as I figure out how to take my processes to the next level. And that's how things are going to have to work, stepwise, stepwise, stepwise. The humans get better, the tools get better, the governance get better, the humans get better, the tools, and we're marching up and right the whole way. It's the only way.
So, Michael, maybe we can hear from you on theoretically that all makes sense, and we're seeing some organizations, including Sammy, one of our clients that we work for, embedding agentic AI guardrails plugins into the cloud environment, for example, which already has hooks for ensuring that commits are only drawing from authoritative sources for third-party code libraries, for example. But what do you see as some of the challenges for organizations? Is it talent? Is it technology? Is it executives' comfort level with empowering agentic AI? Can you kind of talk about where organizations are falling down and what the kind of core barriers to entry are and kind of unlocking that kind of powerful tool for defensive purposes?
Yeah, great question. I really like Sammy's points. Look, AI, the whole use or point of AI, right, is to delegate or extend an individual or a company's agency, right? So you take your agency and I'm extending it or delegating it. You gave the example of 800 different agents, et cetera. Like society and business processes are premised on, agency is scarce, attention is scarce, time is scarce, et cetera. And that model doesn't really apply anymore, right? One of the fundamental reasons, as we talked about earlier, why Mythos is so capable, right, is it's unbounded, right? It can look at code and it can come up with multiple different ways to test exploits all in parallel by parallelizing, agents, et cetera. So going forward, right, the key, right, is how do you take a real risk management framework, and by real risk management, I don't mean risk management, which is theater. I'm talking about actually managing actual risks. So a process where you're actually assessing risk against known threats, the vulnerabilities within your system, business consequence, et cetera, and you're prioritizing it so that you are then giving the business a very concise, clear list of things they need to do to always be improving on the risk profile for the company. And the short answer is most companies are not really good at that pre-Mythos, and they're really not good at it now post-Mythos, right? And there's lots of examples of this. But coming back around to what you're saying, I think from a defensive point of view, the real value here, which people are not talking enough about, right, is the fact that these capabilities, as you pointed out at the top of your question, are just as good at not only finding exploits and flaws that need to be addressed, but they're also really good at and being used to refactor and eliminate tech debt, and a bunch of other things, right? I used to be a federal CIO, and I can tell you a large portion of my budget, way over 50% of my budget, went to servicing tech debt. I know of CISOs who have told me concrete examples of where they had products and services that were scheduled to be sort of re-platformed over a period of time that was measured in months and years, and they've been able to re-platform those applications and services measured in days. So like that is going to be the real transformation business. It's going to be those companies and businesses that can take this capability and effectively deploy it to re-platform their companies, eliminating tech debt and moving out in advanced ways.
Well, this has been excellent, gentlemen, and I do want to circle back on the regulatory question and how GRC fits into that, particularly through the lens of the software development lifecycle, the acceleration of and the pressures for feature release and time to market, while particularly for AI generated and automated code, which has been exponentially increase in volume. So Dan, back to that question on how security, GRC, and legal counsel runs alongside the business. How do you see that fitting in at machine speed?
Yeah, I think in this current context, we don't have clear legal frameworks. We don't have clear guardrails. Sammy and Michael, we've been talking about this, and so the tendency would be to say, I can set that aside. Well, we'll pick that one up when it comes. And I think that's not a best practice. I think the best practice is to act now in anticipation of the development of future legal and regulatory frameworks. There are things you can do now to establish a solid foundation. If you are waiting until 9 months, 18 months from now, when there are legal frameworks, you're going to spend a lot of extra time and money developing, getting to where you need to get, that you could have, if you had done some basic things at this point, you would just save tons of time and money. For example, developing transparency reports, developing initial risk assessment, baseline risk assessments, establishing a governance framework, beginning to capture policies. Those are all things that you can do now, won't cost you very much, and you can build on, iterate on over time, as I think Sammy was saying, that in that stair-step approach. But if you wait until this massive new EU law is passed, or the Congress comes out with something, or there's a major lawsuit that establishes new rules, you're going to end up costing yourself time and money. So it's better to establish a good foundation now.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, I think it's consistent with security practitioners and just developers, particularly within ed, leaning into innovation. There's that same need to lean into kind of building at least some sort of regulatory framework and norms and expectations in the anticipation of that kind of regulatory landscape getting better crystallized. Well, this has been excellent, gentlemen. The level of kind of knowledge and fluency on these issues and the creativity has been very impressive. I just want to, before we close, would like to go around the horn, maybe starting with Michael, then Sammy, then Dan. Based on everything we discussed, we're going to have folks that are both security leaders. We'll likely have GRC professionals. We'll have practitioners who are on the ground trying to kind of implement a number of the best practices that we've been talking about. If you could sort of isolate or discuss one what kind of recommendation of either that we've discussed or maybe something that we've missed for our audience, and then we'll conclude the podcast.
Yeah, sounds great. I'll start. I always think whether you're a CIO, a CISO, or some other executive running a business, right? You always have to think about enabling the business and safeguarding the business. And the question is, this real rise of AI, substantive AI that we're talking about now, specifically in the realm of security, what does that mean to you? If you think about each one of those, enable the business, safeguard, have sort of three pieces to, right? The safeguarding part, right, is use of it for product hardening, to help control enterprise sprawl, and then sort of, defensive use by threat actors. Think, though, also about how this can transform your business on the enabling side. So product and service development, running the business, right, making your business more efficient, and then specifically what I mentioned before, which is the ability to refactor or replatform in real time going forward. That will be the real transformation for business, and those CIO and security related professionals that are able to enable the business to do that at speed will be the real heroes going forward.
Yeah, so I think a lot of managers manage and we delegate, and that's cool. This is the time, though, when you have to go sit down, whether you want to think of it as a time and motion study, or something you learned in business school, or something under Deming, and actually document how your organization works. How is this risk management decision made? How is this security gate in the CI/CD pipeline implemented? Who actually does release engineering, and how does it work? And then we can start thinking about what parts of that we can relegate to an agent, and what parts of that we can make agentic. Starting from the other direction, hey, the boss bought a new tool and said, I have to use it this quarter or I'm going to look like I'm a Luddite, is going to be bad. And so push from knowing what happens and how you can make it better, and not from, hey, look what I found on the ground. It's shiny. I'm going to use it.
Thanks, Sammy. Dan, last word.
I would just to build off that. I think that was excellent, both of those. But I would encourage anyone to stop and in the next week or 10 days begin developing a transparency report. How are we using AI? How do we intend to use it? What are our data sources? What's the infrastructure we're leveraging? That will help you later on down the road if you're in a lawsuit or a regulator. It'll help you in the short run to just explain to your bosses or to show to the board. If you gave the board a very clear one-pager, here's how they will love it. So I'm a big fan of transparency reporting, plain English transparency reporting, just even for your own internal purposes.
Sammy, Michael, Dan, it's been a pleasure working with you to plan for the podcast and to learn about your perspectives, both from government and industry, helping practitioners, security leadership, and even C-suites begin to unpack what Mythos actually means, how to safeguard your enterprise from its potential malicious use, and thinking through the rise of AI coding assistants and how organizations can adapt. Thanks very much, and appreciate your time.